Welcome back. Welcome back. Last year's financial crisis set off an economic earthquake around the world, with the tremors still being felt today. The boss of HSBC, the world's largest bank, said this week that the banking industry owed the real world an apology. So a year since the fall of Lehman's, how much has actually changed, and are we now over the worst? I'm joined by a man who was right there in the eye of the financial storm, Sir John Gee, former deputy of the Bank of England. Let's start right there. We had Nigerian banks having to be bailed out this week. Is this process going to continue, or is this the end of banks needing to be bailed out? Is it solid around the world, more or less?
Well, I think that a year ago we faced the biggest financial crisis for 100 years in the West and the whole world, and the real chance of a Great Depression, a second Great Depression. I think the world has stabilized. I think the threat of a world depression has gone away. In other words, we've stopped the downward spiral. There are still after tremors, and there's still a lot of pain to come. It's rather like being mugged. He may have stopped hitting you, but most of the pain is still to be felt.
Right. And so the banks, where are the banks that are vulnerable still?
Well, I think all the banks are much more solidly based. The confidence has returned. If you look at the financial markets, the world's main banks are now thought to be solid by the markets. They can raise funds, but they've still got a long period, or many of them have still got a long period of readjusting their balance sheets to reduce their dependence on wholesale funding and to increase their capital ratios.
And you've said you think that major event in New York of when Lehman's was allowed to go bust by the US Treasury was a real blow, and that there might have been less of a crisis all around the world if that had been stopped.
Yes, well, events matter, and that was an absolutely key decision. Through the beginning of last year and the summer, there was some re-establishment of confidence that the authorities, and particularly the US authorities, had got a grip on the situation. And if you remember, they bailed out Bear Stearns, or at least helped it transfer. They bailed out Fannie and Freddie. And then when they let Lehman's go, I think that really knocked confidence. And you saw it not just in financial markets, which, as I say, saw the biggest loss of confidence for 100 years, but throughout the world, and you saw world trade begin to dip from about that point. So I think it really had a big impact, and it required quite extraordinary measures by governments right around the world to prevent that turning into a real depression.
And do you think President Obama has got it about right so far, or will there need to be a second major step from him?
Well, I think
a second fiscal.
The US and the Europeans, and indeed the Chinese and other governments, have done the right thing so far. Now they're facing a delicate choice about, do they continue this extraordinary stimulus through government spending, zero interest rates, quantitative measures? When do they stop, and when do they start clawing that back? I don't think that we need another huge stimulus. It's more a question of when do we start tightening again, and I wouldn't expect that to happen seriously for several months to come, certainly.
Thank you very much, John.
Okay, thank you.
And now, is the so-called war on drugs a waste of time, money and lives? For decades we've been fighting this war and no one has been able to claim victory. So what's gone wrong? Is legalization the solution to this problem? For Antonio Maria Costa, director of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, legalizing drugs, he said, would be a historic mistake. And here in the studio is the author of Candy Machine, How Cocaine Took Over the World, Tom Filing. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, Antonio. Let's begin with you. You are obviously of the belief, in your quotes and so on, that in fact, whatever have been the difficulties of enforcing the law, that it is vital that drugs like cocaine and others not be legalized. Why do you feel that so strongly?
Well, you see, my view, of course, reflects the view of unanimous views of government. So it is the government's decision, not my own, or for that matter, the United Nations. What has happened is that the United Nations, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, on a variety of occasions, produced international agreements. They are called conventions that have established the drug control regime. Now, if you look at just at the sheer numbers and compare drug use with the use of other substances which are equally addictive, like tobacco for that matter, or alcohol, you see that the controls have worked, at least to the extent that the percentage of people using drugs around the world is a fraction. It's about 2–3%, depending on the drugs, depending on how we define addiction. With a fraction of the otherwise a very large number of people, 30% of humanity smoking, 20% taking alcohol in one way or another, and as a consequence, the deaths. Deaths due to tobacco are about 5 million a year. Due to alcohol, 2.5 million. The deaths related to drugs is 200,000. I would say that the control have produced important limitation to the otherwise dramatic health consequence of addiction.
Thank you very much. Turning to you, Tom, basically what Antonio was saying there is the reason that drugs should not be legalized is the current system is working. Do you agree with that?
Well, no, I don't. I think that it sounds like a very difficult comparison to make, just to try and prove the point that the reason why far fewer people take these drugs than smoke tobacco or drink alcohol is because they're illegal. And I think this is one of the things that I tried to explore in the book, is how effective the law is, or to what extent the law affects people's decision to take drugs.
So this is completely the reverse of what Antonio was saying. And what did you discover?
Well, some of the research papers that I looked at showed that quite often drug-taking patterns are similar in cities where the police have very different attitudes to policing the drugs trade. For example, in San Francisco, they tend to be rather more heavy-handed than in Amsterdam, and yet the levels were similar. On the subject of Amsterdam, when the police there have chosen not to prosecute recreational cocaine or marijuana users, in the case of marijuana, I know that use rates actually went down. In the case of cocaine, I don't think it had a negligible effect on how many people were choosing to take cocaine. So I think one of the things about prohibition is it suggests that the law is more powerful and more effective and more influential than it actually is on people's choice as to whether or not they do or don't take drugs.
So the suggestion there from Tom is that in fact it's not effective, and that there have been cases, perhaps prohibition is one, where something is prohibited and the taking of it, extraordinary though it seems, is less. I mean, do you think that if cocaine was widely available, legal, the taking of it would be more, much more, or less?
Oh, well, it's very hard to say, but certainly we recognize at the moment that the so-called licit, because they are freely traded, addictive substances like tobacco and alcohol are causing enormous systemic damage, so much that humanity is desperately trying to curb tobacco. I don't understand this movement in one direction for tobacco and in the opposite direction. Thanks God, it's only the view of a private individual. Member states are absolutely, totally, unanimously against legalization of drugs, but we are in their hands, and hopefully that will remain so.
To ban tobacco, to create a black market, would create a situation that we have now with drugs like cocaine, where the harm done by banning it far outweighs the harm done by taking it.
Well, what harm does banning it do?
Oh, I mean, this is what I've tried to record in the book. In the producing countries, in the countries through which cocaine passes, in the countries in which it's consumed, it is an unmitigated disaster. It leaves criminalization of a demand for which there is a strong demand. It creates huge levels of crime of all kinds.
And wealth.
And wealth, yeah. And corruption from that wealth.
I find this argument banal and misguided. Of course, drugs produce disastrous conditions in Afghanistan and Colombia, and that's why major efforts should be engaged in reducing the cultivation. You see, no country in the world has ever prospered on illegality. And cultivating drugs, trading drugs, refining drugs in these two theaters, Afghanistan, Colombia, but Myanmar, Peru, Bolivia, and so forth, is causing dramatic consequences, which are not only related to crime, they are related to insurgency. We see insurgents, the Taliban, for example, in Afghanistan, or we see the FARC and the ELN and the other groups in Colombia prospering on the cultivation of these drugs, opium in one hand and cocaine. And that's why gigantic efforts, much more important than so far, are needed to bring development to these countries, bring development through illicit activity, normal activities, normal agricultural, forest-related activities, so as the farmers are assisted to switch. But to the extent that insurgents protect them, force them, exploit them, take advantage of them, well, of course, illegal activity will continue. So these drugs are causing enormous damage, and I believe that a more systemic, more development-oriented, I'm not only talking about law enforcement, that's only a detail, I would say, more in terms of bringing development there where poverty is convincing and inducing farmers to cultivate illicit drugs.
Is the drug trade, if it grew because you legalized it, would it have those effects, those dangerous effects that it has on countries like the ones that Antonio cited and the ones I mentioned? Would it have worse effects, or do you think in some way it would suddenly become benign?
Well, I mean, I don't want to create too rosy a picture of what legalization might mean. In fact, it means transferring responsibility for the problems created by drug consumption into state hands. That's what I'm proposing. Instead of, at the moment, they're essentially in criminal hands. One of the advantages of legalization is that for those outside consuming countries, countries through which cocaine passes, countries in which cocaine is produced, like Colombia, there is no reason why that could not be illicit business. And in so doing, those illegal armed groups would be deprived of funds, drugs traffickers would pay taxes, there would be an end to corruption of legal politicians and businesses by illegal drugs traffickers. So certainly from the point of view of the producing and distributing countries, legalization would be a boon, an absolute boon.
What I see as a sort of a trade-off which is being missed here. The emphasis is so much on improving security, on reducing the income to organized crime, in reducing the impact of corruptions and so forth. Yes, but why should we, why pursuing all of that, very noble causes, which I support, why should we trade that for a much greater health problem? My position, which is nothing else than the manifestation of unanimity among member states, is to make sure that there is not such a trade-off, that security and safety in our cities, in our ghettos, in our inner parts of unstable communities is guaranteed, rather than giving up the health consequences which otherwise would be inevitable.
Right. Thank you both very much indeed for being with us. We appreciate it. Thank you. And now, cricket superstar Ian Botham joins me after this short break, not a leg break.